The sun rose gently over the ancient city, painting the cobblestone streets in soft shades of gold. Tourists from every corner of the world filled the wide-open square near the royal palace. The air carried the sound of footsteps, laughter, and the clicking of cameras as visitors rushed to capture every angle of the grand buildings, each carved with centuries of history. Flags waved lazily in the morning breeze, and street vendors sold trinkets that promised a memory of the city long after people left. But the highlight of the square, the one thing everyone seemed to gather for, was the sight of the royal guard. Tall men stood straight as iron poles dressed in their famous uniforms. Their red coats gleamed against the sunlight, and their tall bearskin hats added an air of unshakable authority. They did not smile, they did not blink, they did not move. They looked more like statues than living men. By their side stood massive black horses, their coats polished until they shined like mirrors. Every breath from the horses came out as misty clouds, and every flick of their tails carried the strength of disciplined animals trained to perfection. Crowds whispered in awe. For many, it was their first time seeing such a tradition. A father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders so she could look over the heads of strangers. A young couple held hands, smiling as they pointed toward the guards. An elderly woman wiped her eyes, remembering how she had seen the same sight when she was just a little girl, decades ago. Everyone respected the space, keeping a cautious distance. They knew the guards were not entertainers but protectors of heritage, duty, and honor. Yet not everyone in the crowd carried the same respect. Among the sea of visitors stood a small group of tourists who thought differently. They had been laughing loudly ever since they entered the square, treating the sacred place as though it were a circus. Instead of admiring the discipline of the guards, they nudged one another and smirked, pointing their phones toward the soldiers. "Come on," one of them whispered with a mischievous grin. "They're not even real. They're like robots. Let's see if we can make them move." His friends chuckled. They seemed unaware or perhaps careless of the silent warnings given by signs placed around the square. Do not touch the guards. Do not disturb the horses. To them, it was all just a game. The first man stepped forward, clapping his hands loudly near the horse's ear. The animal flicked its ear back in irritation but did not move otherwise. The guard, standing tall beside the horse, did not even blink. The man turned back to his friends and laughed, thinking he had proved his point. Another in the group decided to join in. He bent forward, making silly faces, trying to get the horse to react. The horse only breathed heavier, stamping its hoof once against the stone. The sound echoed like a drumbeat, drawing the attention of the crowd. A ripple of uneasy murmurs spread across the square. Parents pulled their children closer. A mother whispered to her son, "Don't do what they're doing. It's disrespectful." But the foolish tourists ignored everything. Their laughter grew louder. One of them began to mimic the stiff posture of the guard, marching clumsily in circles while saluting like a clown. His friends doubled over with laughter, completely blind to the cold stares from onlookers who did not find it funny at all. The tension in the air grew heavier. The crowd shifted, the once joyful atmosphere now filled with unease. Even the pigeons that had been pecking around the square took flight, as if sensing that something was about to happen. The guards remained statuesque, their discipline unshaken, but every person watching could see the faint tightening of their hands around the reins. The horses snorted louder now, their black eyes flashing with fire. Still, the tourists pushed further. One of them, holding his phone high, leaned closer to one of the horses, trying to snap a picture as if it were part of a comedy show. The animal lifted its head, muscles rippling under its shining coat, and let out a deep, rumbling snort that made several children cry out in fear. The laughter from the tourists faltered for just a second, but pride pushed them on. They did not want to look weak in front of one another. They had come to the square seeking entertainment, and they thought they had found it. They didn't realize they were moments away from teaching themselves the harshest lesson of their journey. An elderly man in the crowd finally spoke up. His voice was shaky but carried enough strength to be heard. "Show respect," he warned. "These guards are not toys. These horses are not for games. You'll regret this if you continue." But the tourists only rolled their eyes. "Relax, old man," one of them sneered, still recording on his phone. "We're just having fun. Nobody's getting hurt." The man shook his head sadly, muttering to himself. Foolish, very foolish. The square grew quieter. Even those who had been laughing and talking moments ago now stood still, their eyes fixed on the tourists. It was as though the entire square itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. One of the horses pawed the ground harder, leaving marks on the stones. The guards remained as still as ever, but the tourists had unknowingly crossed an invisible line. Everyone watching could sense it. The atmosphere was no longer lighthearted, it was heavy, thick with the weight of discipline, history, and centuries of unbroken tradition. The tourists did not see it yet, but the moment of regret was already waiting for them. The square stood in uneasy silence after the foolish tourists continued their mockery. Many in the crowd had expected the men to stop after the horse's loud snort and the elderly man's warning, but instead they carried on with their careless behavior. The tourists, still holding their phones, seemed more concerned with getting funny videos to show off later, rather than respecting where they were standing. To them, this was just another stop on their vacation, a place for jokes and entertainment. But for everyone else watching, the moment had become tense and uncomfortable. One of the tourists, emboldened by his friend's laughter, stepped even closer to the horse. His camera was recording, and he whispered loudly so his phone could pick up his voice. "Look at this. The big scary horse doesn't even move. Useless." He waved his hand just inches away from the horse's long nose. The horse's ears flattened and its body stiffened. Its deep, dark eyes flashed with irritation. A mother standing nearby pulled her young daughter away, whispering, "Don't watch this, sweetheart." The guard holding the reins did not speak. His face remained fixed forward, his posture unbroken. Yet, those who had seen the guards before knew the stillness was not weakness. It was the calm of discipline, the kind of calm that carried centuries of tradition. The guards were not there to entertain tourists. They were symbols of duty and respect, standing firm no matter what happened around them. The crowd grew restless. A group of teenagers from another country whispered among themselves. "This is going too far," one of them said nervously. "They shouldn't do that. What if something happens?" An older woman shook her head in agreement. "Something will happen," she replied quietly. The horses shuffled slightly, their powerful legs tapping the cobblestones with sharp, echoing sounds. Each step carried weight, as if warning the crowd that the line between safety and danger was growing thinner with every foolish act. The air in the square grew heavier. Even the pigeons had disappeared completely, leaving the sky strangely empty. Still, the tourists did not notice. Or perhaps they noticed but didn't care. They laughed louder now, trying to draw more attention to themselves. One of them leaned back toward his friends and said proudly, "Wait until we post this online. Everyone's going to love it." The brave guys who made the royal horses dance, but the horses were not dancing. They were restraining themselves, holding back from instincts honed through years of training and discipline. War horses, after all, were not like ordinary animals. They had been bred for strength, for courage, for steadiness under pressure. And though they were calm by nature, no horse tolerated mockery forever. The crowd's mood shifted further. Where there had once been cheerful chatter, now there was only low murmuring. Some people turned away, not wanting to witness what they felt was coming. Others stayed rooted in place, unable to look away, as if the scene unfolding was too heavy with meaning to ignore. An older gentleman in a gray coat leaned on his walking stick and muttered softly to the couple beside him. "They think this is a joke, but they're forgetting one thing. This isn't their stage. This isn't their moment. It belongs to the guards, to the crown, to the tradition that has stood here longer than their families have been alive." The couple nodded silently. The words seemed to echo the thought already hanging in everyone's mind. The foolish tourists were not just mocking animals. They were mocking the weight of history itself. Then, suddenly, it happened. One of the tourists clapped his hands loudly again, right by the horse's ear. The horse jerked its head high, stamping its hoof against the stone so hard that the sound cracked through the silence like thunder. The entire crowd gasped at once. Several people stepped back, nearly tripping over one another. The tourists froze, their laughter cut short. Their faces paled as they realized they had pushed too far. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. The horse stood tall, its muscles tense, its breath sharp. The guard tightened his grip on the reins, not to control the horse, but to steady it, to remind it that discipline mattered even now. His expression never changed, but those watching closely could see the faint flex of his jaw. The tourists shuffled back nervously. Their confidence was crumbling. One whispered to the other, "Maybe we should stop." But another shook his head stubbornly, trying to save face in front of the crowd. "It's fine. Nothing's going to happen. They're not allowed to move anyway. The arrogance in his voice carried through the silence, and the crowd reacted with quiet disapproval. A child tugged at his father's sleeve and asked in a small voice, "Why are they being mean?" The father sighed, his eyes still fixed on the tourists. Because they don't understand respect. The tourists were finally beginning to feel the pressure. The laughter was gone, replaced with uneasy glances at one another. They were surrounded not only by the guards and their towering horses, but by the silent judgment of hundreds of strangers. Cameras that had once been pointed at the guards were now turned toward them, recording every foolish move, every sign of fear beginning to show on their faces. It was then that one of the guards, still standing perfectly straight, shifted slightly. His boot struck the ground with a sharp sound, and the horse beside him lifted its head higher. It was a small movement, but to the crowd it was monumental. Gasps filled the square again. The message was clear. The guards were aware, they were watching, and they would not allow this to go any further. The tourists stood frozen, their earlier arrogance melting away under the weight of silence and authority. One of them lowered his phone slowly, realizing the funny video he had wanted to capture was turning into evidence of his own humiliation. His friends shuffled awkwardly, their shoulders hunched as though they wanted to disappear into the crowd. But the square was not going to let them go unnoticed. The tourists had drawn attention to themselves, and now they had no way to escape it. Every pair of eyes was fixed on them, waiting, watching, and silently demanding that they face the consequences of their actions. The uneasy air grew heavier, pressing down on everyone present. The guards still did not speak, but their silence was louder than any words. The tourists looked at each other, and for the first time since they entered the square, they realized something powerful. They were not in control. The moment of regret was coming closer, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. The tension in the square deepened with every second. The crowd had fallen completely silent, as if the very stones beneath their feet were holding their breath. The foolish tourists, who only moments ago had been laughing and joking, now shifted nervously. Their smiles had faded, replaced by tight lips and uneasy eyes. The square no longer felt like their playground. It felt like a stage where everyone was waiting for them to fail. The horses continued to stamp their hooves, their sleek black bodies rippling with controlled strength. Their breaths came out heavy and sharp, rising like smoke in the cool air. The guards held them steady, their posture still perfect, their faces still emotionless. Yet anyone watching could sense the iron discipline it took to maintain that silence. The guards were not ignoring the disrespect. They were containing it, giving the tourists one last chance to realize the seriousness of their mistake. But arrogance is often stronger than wisdom, and the tourists had not yet learned. One of them, trying to recover his pride in front of the crowd, lifted his phone again. He forced a grin onto his face and said loudly, "See? Nothing happened. They can't do anything. They're just statues." His words rang out across the square, and though he meant them as a joke, they sounded hollow. No one laughed. Instead, the crowd responded with glares and disapproving whispers. A little boy clutched his mother's hand and asked softly, "Why don't they stop?" The mother shook her head and whispered back, "Because they don't understand respect." The boy frowned, his young mind already recognizing the truth that the adults in the crowd had known all along. One of the other tourists tugged at his friend's arm nervously. "Maybe we should leave," he whispered, his voice shaking. "People are staring. This doesn't feel right anymore." But the leader of the group, unwilling to lose face, shook his head. "No, we came here for fun and we'll leave when we want." "They can't touch us," the crowd gasped quietly at his boldness. A woman near the front whispered, "They have no idea what they're inviting upon themselves." The horse closest to the group suddenly tossed its head, its bridle clinking loudly as the leather straps shifted. The sound echoed in the stillness, and the tourists flinched. One stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The crowd murmured again, their voices rising with anticipation. Everyone could feel it. The moment of consequence was drawing nearer. An old man with a cane leaned on the palace wall, his eyes narrowed. He spoke softly, but those nearby could hear him. "These guards have stood here longer than these boys have been alive. They serve with silence, but silence is not weakness. They're about to learn that." The tourists, still nervous, tried to act brave. One of them laughed awkwardly, the sound too loud, too forced. "Relax, guys," he said, though his own voice trembled. "It's fine. Nothing's going to happen. We're just tourists. We'll be gone tomorrow." But the square did not forget, and neither did the guards. The silence of the soldiers was heavier than any scolding words. Their stillness became a mirror, showing the tourists their own foolishness. For the first time, the group began to feel small, trapped beneath the weight of centuries of tradition that hung over the square like a shadow. The tourists' bravado cracked further when one of the guards moved again. It was not a large movement, only a precise step of his polished black boot. But the sound it made on the stone was sharp, commanding, undeniable. The crowd gasped again. The tourists froze in place, their faces pale. They had mocked, laughed, and taunted, but now they stood on the edge of consequences they had never expected. The horses responded instantly to the step, their bodies stiffening, their ears pricked forward. Their discipline matched the guards, but their power was alive and impossible to ignore. The tourists suddenly saw the truth in their size, the strength in every muscle, the weight of hooves that could crush stone. They realized too late that they had not been teasing harmless animals, but trained war horses, creatures whose history was tied to battles, parades, and royal duty. The leader of the group swallowed hard. His hands shook slightly as he lowered his phone, the red recording light still blinking. He looked at his friends, but none of them smiled anymore. Their arrogance had drained away, leaving behind only fear and embarrassment. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were judging. A man muttered loudly, "Disrespectful fools." A woman added, "They're an insult to every visitor who came here to admire this place." The shame pressed down on the tourists, but pride still held them in place. They wanted to walk away, but they were too stubborn to admit defeat. Then came the sound that shook the square, a sharp command, deep and firm from the tallest guard. He did not raise his voice, but every syllable cut through the air with authority. "Stand back." The tourists jumped as though the words had been thunder. The guard's eyes were still fixed forward, his posture unbroken. Yet the power of his voice carried centuries of command. The horses snorted and shifted, their hooves striking sparks against the stone. The crowd's murmurs rose into a wave. People gasped, whispered, and pointed. Some lifted their phones higher, recording every second of the unfolding scene. Parents pulled their children closer, not out of fear, but out of reverence for what they were witnessing. The foolish tourists finally began to realize the depth of their mistake. They had thought of themselves as clever pranksters, men who could outwit tradition with laughter and arrogance. But now they stood exposed, their pride stripped away, surrounded by the heavy silence of the crowd and the living strength of the guards and their horses. Their hearts pounded faster, and their breaths came shorter. One of them whispered almost to himself, "We shouldn't have done this." His voice trembled, the bravado gone completely. His friends nodded silently, but it was too late to undo what they had done. The square had turned into a stage, and the world was their audience. They were no longer the ones controlling the moment. The guards had not moved much. The horses had not charged, yet the tourists had already lost. The weight of discipline, respect, and tradition was crushing them far more than any physical force could. The air grew still again, waiting for what would follow. The foolish tourists stood frozen, trapped between pride and regret. They could not laugh anymore. They could not mock anymore. The only thing left was the lesson they were about to learn. The air in the square felt heavier than stone. The foolish tourists stood frozen, their laughter long gone, their pride melting away in front of the silent guards, the restless horses, and the judging eyes of hundreds of strangers. The leader of the group, who once smirked with arrogance, now looked pale. His phone was still in his hand, but he no longer dared to lift it. The flashing red light of the recording mocked him, capturing not his cleverness but his fear. The horses were no longer still ornaments. Their large bodies shifted with tension, their hooves striking the ground with deliberate force. Each sound echoed like a drumbeat in the silence of the square. The crowd had stepped back, leaving a wide space around the tourists as though an invisible circle had been drawn. Everyone knew something important was about to happen. It was no longer a show, no longer a simple morning at the palace. It had become a lesson, carved into stone and tradition, one that would not be forgotten soon. The guards still did not move freely, but their presence had changed. Their stillness was no longer neutral. It was sharp, heavy, and commanding. The tallest guard, standing at the front with his massive horse, finally shifted his head slightly. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. He did not need to speak yet. His presence alone demanded silence and respect. The tourists felt it immediately. Their confidence collapsed further. One of them, his face red with shame, whispered under his breath, "We should leave." His friend nodded quickly, his eyes darting toward the crowd that was still filming. But the leader, still clinging to the last thread of pride, shook his head. "No," he muttered. "If we walk away now, we'll look weak." He didn't realize that weakness had already claimed them. The crowd had seen enough to know who looked foolish. Parents whispered to their children, teaching them the lesson of respect that the tourists had failed to understand. Visitors from other countries shook their heads, embarrassed by the behavior they had witnessed. Then came the sound that broke the tension. A sharp stomp of the guard's boot rang out across the square. The polished leather struck the stone with precision, and the entire square seemed to tremble. The tourists flinched violently, their nerves betraying them. The horses responded instantly, lifting their heads high, their nostrils flaring, their strong legs stamping harder against the cobblestones. The ground seemed to vibrate with their restrained power. The crowd gasped as though one breath had been taken at once. Children clutched their parents. Even the pigeons that had returned to the rooftops scattered again into the air. The tourists could not hide their fear anymore. One stumbled back, bumping into his friend, while another nearly dropped his phone. Their faces were drained of color, and then in a calm yet powerful voice the guard spoke. His words were simple, but they cut through the air like steel. "Respect. The guard, respect the horse, respect the crown." The square froze. His tone was not loud, yet it carried a weight that could silence even the most stubborn soul. The tourists felt the words as though they were carved into their very bones. Their arrogance had no shield against such authority. The leader of the group, once so bold, lowered his eyes, unable to meet the guard's stare. His hand shook, and he finally turned off the recording on his phone. The crowd, still silent, began to shift. Some people nodded with approval. Others whispered quietly about the importance of tradition. The shame of the tourists was complete. They had not been punished physically, yet they felt as if the entire world had witnessed their downfall. The horses stamped again, their strength filling the air with an unspoken warning. The guards held them firmly, their discipline unbroken, but the message was clear. This was the last chance. The tourists were standing on the very edge of consequences. Any further disrespect, and they would face something far more severe than humiliation. Finally, one of the tourists broke. He lowered his head and stepped back slowly, his voice trembling as he muttered, "We're sorry." His words were soft, but the crowd heard them. A wave of relief passed through the square. The others followed his lead, stepping back, their heads bowed. The arrogance that had fueled them was gone, replaced with regret and shame. The guard did not respond. He did not need to. His silence was the answer, his posture the reminder that some traditions stood higher than pride. The crowd, however, responded. A few clapped softly, not for the tourists but for the guards, for their discipline, their dignity, their ability to stand unshaken in the face of disrespect. The tourists wanted to disappear. They wanted to melt into the ground and escape the eyes that burned into them from every side. But there was no escape. They had made themselves the center of attention, and now they had to endure the weight of their mistake. The leader finally turned to his friends and whispered harshly, "Let's go." His voice was no longer proud. It was broken. The group moved quickly toward the edge of the square, their shoulders hunched, their eyes fixed on the ground. The crowd parted for them, but it was not kindness, it was judgment. No one smiled at them. No one laughed with them. Phones followed their every step, capturing their retreat, their humiliation. As they left, the square slowly returned to its rhythm. The guards stood still once more, their faces calm, their bodies steady. The horses snorted softly, stamping the ground a final time before settling back into their disciplined silence. The tension faded, replaced by awe and respect. The tourists were gone, but the lesson remained, stronger than before. The father who had lifted his daughter onto his shoulders earlier leaned down and whispered to her, "Do you see now? Respect is not just a word. It is shown in how we act, how we treat others, and how we honor traditions." The little girl nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. The crowd began to murmur again, this time with admiration. Some spoke of the strength of the guards, others of the power of silence, and many about the foolishness of those who had thought themselves clever. The square became alive once more, but it carried a new energy, an energy of respect, of quiet pride, of reverence for something greater than any single person. The tourists had come to mock, but they left carrying regret, and everyone who had been there knew they would never forget the lesson they had witnessed. The guards did not need to punish them with force. Tradition itself had humbled them. The sun shone brighter above the palace walls as though even the sky approved of the order restored. The guards remained still, their duty unbroken, their honor untarnished. The horses stood tall, majestic once again, guardians of history. And the square, though filled with strangers from every corner of the world, now shared one common truth. Respect is always earned, and disrespect always carries regret. The square slowly settled again after the group of tourists had finally walked away. The sound of their footsteps faded, swallowed by the hum of the crowd that had returned to its normal rhythm. But the memory of what had just happened lingered. People exchanged glances, spoke in low tones, and shared what they had witnessed with those beside them. It was as though everyone felt a part of something bigger, a silent lesson that would live in their minds long after they left the city. The guards had returned to their stillness, their faces carved in discipline, their bodies strong and unmoving. Their tall black horses stood calmly again, breathing slowly, their earlier tension fading into composed silence. The square, once heavy with unease, now felt steadier, as though the natural order had been restored. Respect had returned to where it belonged. Families gathered their children closer, many kneeling to explain what they had just seen. A mother held her son's hand tightly and said softly, "Do you see now why respect is important? Those guards are not there for us to laugh at. They are there to serve, to protect, and to stand for something greater than themselves." The boy nodded, his wide eyes fixed on the guards, his young heart filled with admiration instead of curiosity. An old man leaned on his cane and smiled faintly. "That was a lesson they will never forget," he said to no one in particular. His voice carried the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to understand that some lessons are not taught in classrooms, but in moments like these, when pride meets discipline and is forced to bow. The square slowly filled again with the sounds of normal life. Camera shutters clicking, soft laughter, footsteps moving over stone. But beneath the ordinary sounds was a current of reverence. The foolish tourists had turned the square into a stage of humiliation for themselves, but for everyone else, the event had turned into a reminder of tradition's power. The tourists themselves had vanished down a nearby street, their voices low, their faces flushed with shame. They spoke in hurried whispers, no longer eager to record, no longer eager to draw attention. Their phones were tucked away, their heads bent low. The arrogance that had carried them into the square had broken like glass, leaving behind only regret. They had wanted to become the center of attention. Instead, they had become an example of what not to do, and they knew deep down that the videos captured by others in the crowd would spread far beyond the square. Their mistake would be remembered not only by those who stood there, but by countless others who would see the story unfold later. Meanwhile, in the square, the guards remained unchanged. That was their duty, their pride. No matter what happened around them, they stood like statues carved of flesh and bone, representing centuries of unbroken discipline. The horses, calm once more, flicked their tails and shifted their weight, towering and majestic. Together, man and animal formed an image that no tourist could truly understand until they had seen it with their own eyes. The silent strength of honor. The crowd began to move on, yet conversations about what had happened followed them into nearby streets, cafes, and shops. A group of students who had been visiting from another country talked excitedly. "Did you see their faces?" one asked. They thought they could do anything, but the guards didn't even move until the very end. "That's power," another student nodded. "It's not about shouting or fighting. It's about discipline. That's real strength." Even those who had only watched quietly found themselves thinking deeply about what they had seen. The image of the horses stamping their hooves, the guards standing tall, and the tourists shrinking in shame would stay with them. It was a story they would tell others, a memory carried across borders and years. As the day wore on, the square continued to welcome new groups of visitors. Some had already heard whispers of what had happened earlier. They approached with hushed tones, standing a little further back, their eyes wider with caution. The story was already spreading, turning into something larger than a simple morning event. It became a tale of how foolishness met with dignity and was silenced without a single blow. The foolish tourists, for their part, walked through the streets with heavy steps. They avoided eye contact with others, too ashamed to be recognized. They argued quietly among themselves, some blaming each other, others simply wishing the ground would swallow them whole. But no matter how much they tried to push it away, they could not erase the memory of the guard's voice, the sharp stomp of the boot, the sound of the horses striking stone, and the cold eyes of the crowd that had witnessed their humiliation. That night, as they sat in their hotel room, none of them laughed. Their phones were full of videos, but not the kind they had imagined. They had wanted to capture something funny, something to brag about. Instead, their recording showed their own foolishness, their own shame. And worse, they knew that the videos from the crowd would soon reach others. Their mistake was no longer private. It was public, etched into the memory of the city itself. Back at the palace square, the guards continued their duty as though nothing had happened. For them, it was another day. Another moment where discipline had proven stronger than arrogance. They did not need to raise their hands or step out of formation to make their point. Their silence had been enough. Their stillness had carried more power than any action. That was the way of tradition. To remain steady no matter the storm, to be unshaken in the face of disrespect, and to remind the world that respect was not optional. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the palace walls in soft orange light. The crowd thinned as evening approached, but the story of what had happened would travel with them to their homes, to their families, to their friends. It would be told again and again, how a group of foolish tourists thought they could mock the royal guard and their horses, only to find themselves crushed by the weight of silence, discipline, and respect. The lesson was simple, but powerful. Respect is not just for those who demand it. It is for traditions that carry history, for symbols that stand for something greater, for people and animals trained with discipline and honor. And disrespect, no matter how small it seems, always carries consequences. The foolish tourists had learned that the hard way. They had arrived with arrogance and left with regret. The guards, on the other hand, remained untouched, their duty carried out with the same dignity it had held for centuries. The horses stood tall, the square stood strong, and the crown's honor remained unshaken. And so the story ended where it began, with the guard standing firm, the horses gleaming in the fading light, and the square filled with visitors. But now those visitors looked on with new eyes. They saw not just soldiers in red coats and tall hats, not just horses standing still, but the living symbols of discipline that had silenced arrogance without ever breaking their stillness. It was a lesson the city had taught for centuries and would continue to teach for centuries more. The foolish tourists would be forgotten as individuals, their names unknown. But their mistake would be remembered in whispers, in warnings, in stories told to future visitors, and the square would stand ready, waiting for the next moment when pride would meet silence and regret would follow.